Life has a strange way of teaching us lessons. The more we try to control every little detail, the outcomes, the timing, the way people respond, the heavier everything begins to feel. We plan carefully. We think ahead. We try to stay one step in front of uncertainty. And yet, instead of clarity, we find tension. Instead of progress, resistance. Somewhere along the way, we stop living and start managing everything, including our own peace. The Stoics saw this clearly. The problem isn't effort, it's attachment. It's the quiet belief that things must go a certain way for us to feel okay. Marcus Aurelius wrote about accepting what unfolds, not as weakness, but as strength. Because the moment you stop fighting reality, you stop wasting energy on what was never yours to control, and in that space, something shifts. The mind settles, the pressure loosens, and clarity begins to return. And when that happens, life starts to move differently. Not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped resisting it. You can feel it building quietly, almost beneath the surface. That frustration of doing everything the way it's supposed to be done, and still not arriving where you expected. You plan carefully. You stay disciplined. You follow the steps that should lead somewhere meaningful. And yet, the result feels delayed, or distorted, or completely absent. At first, it doesn't seem like a problem. It feels like responsibility, like you're being careful, intentional, in control. But slowly, without realizing it, that intention tightens. It becomes heavier. You start replaying conversations, questioning decisions that were already made, adjusting small details that didn't need adjusting, convincing yourself that one more change might finally unlock the outcome you've been chasing. And here's the strange part. The harder you try to fix it, the more complicated everything becomes. What once felt simple now feels layered with pressure. You're no longer acting, you're calculating. No longer moving forward, you're trying to manage every possible outcome in advance. And that shift changes everything. The process stops feeling natural. It starts to feel forced. That force creates friction, not physically, but mentally. Your mind doesn't turn off. It keeps scanning, adjusting, anticipating, as if life were a system that could be perfected if you just thought hard enough. But life doesn't open up under pressure. It resists it. This is where something important gets misunderstood. Effort isn't the problem. Discipline isn't the problem. The issue is when effort turns into control. Effort stays grounded. It focuses on what you can do right now. Control reaches beyond that. It tries to manage outcomes that haven't happened yet, predict reactions, secure certainty, and in doing that, it pulls you away from what's actually in front of you. You stop being present with your actions because your mind is already trying to secure a future that isn't guaranteed. That's where the tension comes from, not from doing too much, but from trying to hold on to something that isn't yours to hold. And over time, this starts to affect everything. Even progress stops feeling satisfying. You achieve something, but your mind immediately moves to the next concern. Is it enough? Is it happening fast enough? What if it doesn't lead where it's supposed to? That constant evaluation drains the meaning out of what you're doing. Growth turns into pressure. Effort turns into obligation. And slowly, everything starts to feel heavier than it actually is. There's a quiet truth in this. When you try to control too many variables at once, you don't gain clarity, you lose it. Your attention becomes scattered. Your decisions become reactive. You start second-guessing instincts that were once clear, not because they were wrong, but because you've layered too many expectations on top of them. It's like holding water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away, and yet the instinct remains the same. Grip harder, think more, control everything, but that instinct is exactly what creates the problem. That's why feeling stuck isn't always about a lack of movement. It's often about too much internal interference. You're moving, but not cleanly, acting, but not freely. There's always that extra layer of pressure shaping every decision, every thought, every step forward. And that pressure disconnects you from the natural rhythm of progress. Because real progress isn't just action, it's alignment. It's being fully present with what you're doing, without constantly trying to force it into a specific outcome. And beneath all of this, there's usually a belief driving it. The belief that if you don't control things, they'll fall apart. That if you relax, even slightly, you'll lose your chance. That everything depends on how tightly you manage it. But that belief comes from fear, not clarity. It assumes your power lies in controlling outcomes, when in reality, your power lies in how you show up to the process itself. When that gets overlooked, control becomes a substitute for trust. And trust is exactly what's missing when everything starts to feel overwhelming. Marcus Aurelius said it simply: you have power over your mind, not outside events. The moment you step outside of that, you lose stability. And the more energy you spend trying to control what isn't yours, the weaker you become where it actually matters. If this way of thinking is starting to shift something in you, then stay with it. Build on it. And if you want to keep going deeper into this, please subscribe. Because this isn't about motivation, it's about training your mind to stay clear, steady, and grounded no matter what life throws at you. When you start to see this clearly, something shifts. Not all at once, but gradually. You begin to notice how much of your stress comes not from what you're doing, but from what you're trying to control beyond that. You start to recognize the difference between acting with intention and acting with pressure. And that awareness creates space. Space to step back, space to breathe, space to return to a way of moving that feels grounded instead of forced. Because the truth is, nothing you're chasing responds well to tension. But it responds very differently when you move with clarity, focus, and just enough detachment to let things unfold without gripping them too tightly. There's a moment where things start to feel heavier than they should, and it doesn't come from doing too much, but from holding on to too much that was never yours to carry. It often goes unnoticed at first. You're thinking about outcomes, replaying timelines in your head, imagining how things should unfold and when they should happen. You tell yourself that this is just part of being responsible, that this is what it takes to succeed. But slowly, the weight builds. Not because life is asking more from you, but because you're trying to manage things that don't actually belong to your control. And that's where the shift happens, quietly but powerfully. You move from acting with clarity into thinking with tension, and everything begins to feel unstable, even if nothing around you has actually changed. It becomes clearer when you take a step back and look at what's really within your reach. Your actions are yours. The effort you put in, the way you carry yourself, the consistency you choose to maintain, those are all grounded, stable, and fully available to you at any moment. But then there are the other elements, the way someone responds, the exact timing of an opportunity, the outcome of something you've worked toward for weeks or even months. These things exist outside of you, influenced by variables you can't fully see or control, and yet it's those exact things that the mind tends to cling to the most. It tries to predict them, shape them, secure them in advance, and when it can't, it reacts with tension. That tension is often mistaken for care. It feels like you're just invested, like you're being serious about what matters. But there's a subtle difference between caring about something and attaching your stability to it. When your emotional state starts, depending on how something turns out, you've crossed into a different space. Now your peace is no longer steady. It rises and falls with outcomes, with responses, with timing. You feel good when things align and unsettled when they don't. And because those things are unpredictable, your internal state becomes unpredictable too. It's not that you're doing anything wrong. It's that you've tied something stable to something unstable, and the result is constant fluctuation. This is why the more you fixate on a specific result, the more anxious you begin to feel. Not because the goal itself is a problem, but because of how tightly you're holding on to it. There's an invisible pressure that builds when your mind starts saying, "This has to work, this has to happen now, this needs to go exactly as planned." That pressure doesn't make you more effective. It actually does the opposite. It narrows your thinking. It makes you reactive instead of clear. And over time, it drains your energy in a way that feels hard to explain, because it's happening internally, not externally. What makes this even more challenging is how natural it feels. The mind is wired to seek certainty. It wants to know what's coming, how things will turn out, whether the effort will pay off. And when it doesn't have those answers, it tries to create them. It fills in the gaps with assumptions, expectations, and imagined scenarios. But those constructions don't create stability. They create attachment. And attachment, when directed toward things outside your control, becomes a constant source of tension. It's like trying to anchor yourself to something that keeps moving. No matter how tightly you hold on, it never fully settles. This is where the Stoic perspective becomes so grounded and practical. It doesn't tell you to stop caring or to withdraw from your goals. It simply draws a clear line between what is yours and what isn't. It brings your attention back to the only place where real influence exists, the present moment, and the choices you make within it. Everything else, no matter how important it feels, exists outside that boundary. And once you start to see that clearly, something begins to shift. Not in the world around you, but in how you relate to it. Epictetus captured this idea in a way that feels almost simple at first glance, but carries a depth that reveals itself over time. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. That distinction, when fully understood, removes a huge amount of unnecessary pressure. It doesn't eliminate challenges. It doesn't guarantee outcomes, but it stabilizes your position within the process. It allows you to engage fully with what you're doing without constantly reaching beyond it in search of certainty. And that changes the entire experience. As that understanding settles in, your approach begins to evolve. You still take action, but it feels different. There's less urgency, less strain. You're no longer trying to force a result into existence. Instead, you're focusing on doing your part as clearly and consistently as possible. And when the outcome finally arrives, whatever it may be, it doesn't shake you the same way. Because your sense of stability was never tied to it in the first place. It was rooted in something far more reliable. Your own ability to act with clarity, regardless of how things unfold. It becomes even clearer when you look at how this dynamic shows up in everyday interactions, especially in moments where something feels like it really matters. Someone walks into a conversation already carrying an invisible weight, trying to say the right thing, trying to avoid saying the wrong thing, carefully measuring every word as if the outcome depends entirely on precision. There's a constant internal dialogue running in the background, analyzing tone, timing, reactions. Every pause feels significant. Every response feels like something that needs to be interpreted. On the surface, it might look like effort, like attention to detail, like someone who cares. But underneath, it's tension. And that tension doesn't stay hidden for long. It starts to show in subtle ways. The way the voice tightens slightly, the way the body language becomes less natural, the way the conversation feels a bit forced, even if the words themselves are fine. People might not consciously identify what's happening, but they feel it. There's a sense that something isn't flowing, not because the person lacks value, but because they're trying to manage how that value is perceived in real time. And the more they try to control that perception, the more unnatural the interaction becomes. It's not the content of what they're saying that creates distance, it's the pressure behind it. Then you see someone else in a similar situation, but the energy feels completely different. There's no visible effort to impress, no constant adjustment happening beneath the surface. They speak in a way that feels grounded, not rehearsed. They listen without immediately planning what to say next. There's space in the interaction, a kind of ease that allows things to unfold naturally. And because of that, people respond differently. There's a sense of comfort, a sense of openness, The conversation flows without friction, and what stands out isn't anything specific they said, but how they carried themselves while saying it. That difference often gets misunderstood. It's easy to assume that the second person is simply more confident by nature, or that they have some inherent advantage, but the real difference lies in their relationship to the outcome. They're not trying to control how they're perceived in every moment. They're not attaching their sense of worth to how the interaction unfolds. And because of that, their attention stays where it actually matters, on the present moment, on the exchange itself. They're engaged, but not gripping. And that creates a completely different experience, both for them and for the person they're interacting with. Carl Jung once pointed out that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That idea extends beyond irritation and into these moments of comparison. When you notice the difference between tension and ease in others, it often reflects something internal that hasn't been fully addressed yet. The need to control perception usually comes from a deeper place, a fear of being misunderstood, rejected, or not valued. And that fear creates pressure. It pushes you to manage every detail, to anticipate every possibility, to stay one step ahead of any potential outcome. But in doing so, it pulls you away from authenticity. As this pattern repeats, it begins to shape more than just individual interactions. It influences how you show up in general. Conversations start to feel like performances instead of exchanges. Relationships begin to feel like something that needs to be maintained through effort, rather than something that can develop naturally. And over time, that creates a sense of fatigue. Not because connecting with others is inherently exhausting, but because trying to control how that connection unfolds requires constant mental energy. It becomes less about being present and more about managing impressions. There's a quiet shift that happens when you start to let go of that need. It doesn't mean you stop caring about how you show up. It means you stop trying to control how every moment is received. You begin to trust that clarity and presence are enough, without needing to be constantly adjusted, and with that trust comes a different kind of stability. You're no longer reacting to every small change in the interaction. You're not thrown off by pauses, by unexpected responses, by things not going exactly as imagined. You stay grounded even when things are uncertain. That grounded state changes the way others experience you. There's less pressure in the interaction, which makes it easier for them to relax as well. Communication becomes more natural, more open. And ironically, the very thing that was being chased before, positive response, connection, approval, starts to happen more easily. Not because it's being forced, but because the conditions for it are finally present. When there's no tension pushing against the interaction, there's nothing blocking it from unfolding naturally. What becomes clear through all of this is that value isn't something that needs to be constantly proven in real time. It's something that's already there, expressed through how you carry yourself, rather than how tightly you manage every detail. The moment you stop trying to control how you're perceived, you create space for something more genuine to come through, and that shift, subtle as it may seem, changes the entire dynamic. Because in the absence of pressure, both you and the people around you can finally engage without resistance, and that's where real connection begins. This is where detachment starts to feel confusing for a lot of people, because it's often misunderstood as indifference. It sounds like something cold, something distant, something that removes meaning from what you're doing. But that's not what it is. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop tying your inner stability to how things turn out. It's a shift in where your emotional weight sits. Instead of placing it on the result, you place it on how you show up. And that small shift changes everything, even though nothing on the outside looks different at first. There's a quiet but important distinction between wanting something and depending on it. Wanting allows space. It leaves room for movement, for adaptation, for growth. Depending, on the other hand, closes that space. It creates pressure. It turns the outcome into something that feels necessary for your sense of peace. And when that happens, every delay feels like something is going wrong. Every obstacle feels like a personal setback. It's no longer just part of the process. It becomes something that threatens your stability. And that's where emotional exhaustion begins to build. You start noticing how your mood shifts based on progress. When things seem to be moving forward, there's a sense of relief, maybe even a brief moment of confidence. But the moment something slows down or changes direction, that feeling disappears. Doubt creeps in. Frustration follows. And suddenly, you're back in that cycle of trying to fix, adjust, control. It becomes a pattern that repeats itself, not because the situation demands it, but because your sense of balance is tied to something outside of you, and anything outside of you is, by nature, unstable. What makes this pattern difficult to break is how justified it feels. You tell yourself that of course this matters, of course the outcome is important, and that part is true. The goal, the relationship, the opportunity, those things can hold real value. But the issue isn't the value of the goal, it's the weight you assign to it internally. When your sense of calm depends on that outcome, you're no longer approaching it with clarity. You're approaching it with pressure. And pressure changes the way you think, the way you act, and the way you experience everything along the way. Seneca captured this in a way that feels almost direct enough to overlook if you're not paying attention. He said that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. That suffering isn't coming from the goal itself, it's coming from everything you've attached to it. The expectations, the timelines, the imagined consequences of things not working out. All of that builds up in your mind until the situation feels heavier than it actually is. And once that happens, even simple steps start to feel difficult, because you're no longer just taking action, you're carrying the weight of everything that might go wrong. As you begin to see this more clearly, the idea of detachment starts to take on a different meaning. It's not about stepping away from what matters, it's about stepping away from the need for it to unfold in a specific way. You still move forward, you still put in the effort, but you do it without that constant internal pressure. You allow things to develop at their own pace, without interpreting every delay as failure or every obstacle as a sign that something is wrong. And in that space, your thinking becomes clearer. Your actions become more precise. You're no longer reacting to fear. You're responding with intention. This shift also changes how you experience progress. Instead of constantly measuring how close you are to the outcome, you begin to focus on the quality of what you're doing right now. There's a sense of presence that wasn't there before. You're more aware of your actions, more connected to the process. And because of that, the process itself starts to feel more meaningful. It's no longer just a means to an end. It becomes something you can actually engage with fully, without constantly looking ahead for validation. Over time, this creates a kind of quiet resilience, not the kind that comes from forcing yourself to push through, but the kind that comes from not being shaken every time something doesn't go as planned. You're still aware of what you want, but you're not dependent on it in the same way. There's a steadiness that starts to build, a sense that no matter how things unfold, you'll be able to adjust, to continue, to stay grounded. And that steadiness becomes more valuable than any specific outcome, because it stays with you regardless of what happens. As this way of moving becomes more natural, something interesting begins to happen. The same goals that once felt heavy start to feel lighter, not because they've changed, but because your relationship to them has. You're no longer gripping them tightly, trying to force them into place. You're allowing them to develop while staying rooted in your own actions. And in that balance, you begin to experience a different kind of progress. One that isn't driven by pressure, but guided by clarity. One that doesn't drain you, but supports you as you move forward. As this begins to settle, attention naturally shifts inward, because the real weight of experience rarely comes from the event itself. It comes from the meaning you assign to it. Two people can walk through the same situation and carry completely different outcomes within them. One walks away feeling defeated, questioning their worth, replaying every detail as proof that something is lacking. The other walks away with a quieter response, seeing the same moment as part of a longer path, something to learn from rather than something to be defined by. The difference isn't in what happened, it's in how the mind chose to frame it. And that framing shapes everything that follows. This is where the idea of control takes on a deeper meaning, because it moves beyond actions and into interpretation. External events come and go, often without warning, often without fairness. They don't ask for permission, and they don't align themselves neatly with expectations, but the space between the event and your reaction, that space belongs to you. It's subtle, often overlooked, but it's always there. And within that space lies the ability to decide how something is understood, not in a forced, artificial way, but in a deliberate, grounded way that allows you to see clearly instead of reacting immediately. When that space is ignored, thoughts tend to take over automatically. A setback becomes a conclusion, a delay becomes a failure, a rejection becomes a statement about identity rather than a single moment in time. And because those interpretations feel immediate and convincing, they rarely get questioned. They settle in quickly, shaping emotions, influencing behavior, reinforcing patterns that repeat themselves without much resistance. It starts to feel like reality itself is heavy, when in truth, much of that weight is being added internally. Carl Jung once wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That line points directly to this process. The thoughts that go unnoticed, the interpretations that feel automatic, the quiet assumptions that shape how you see yourself and the world, those are the forces that quietly guide your experience. When they remain unexamined, they feel like truth. They feel fixed. But once you begin to notice them, to observe them without immediately accepting them, something shifts. The grip they once had begins to loosen. That shift doesn't mean every negative thought disappears. It means you stop treating every thought as a fact. You begin to see that a thought is simply a mental event, not a final conclusion. It arises, it passes, and it only gains strength when it's believed without question. This creates a different relationship with your own mind. Instead of being pulled in every direction by whatever thought appears next, you begin to stand slightly apart from it, observing rather than reacting, choosing rather than absorbing. As that awareness grows, the same situations that once felt overwhelming start to feel more manageable. Not because they've changed, but because your interpretation of them has. A challenge becomes something to navigate rather than something to fear. A mistake becomes information rather than evidence of failure. There's a sense of perspective that wasn't there before, a steadiness that comes from recognizing that your experience is not dictated solely by what happens, but by how you understand what happens. This is where real power begins to take shape, not in controlling circumstances, but in directing perception. The Stoics understood that while events are often outside of reach, interpretation is not. It remains within your influence at all times, even when everything else feels uncertain. And when that influence is used with clarity, it changes the entire landscape of experience. Situations that once drained you begin to lose their intensity. Reactions that once felt automatic begin to slow down. There's more space, more control, not over what happens, but over how it's received. That doesn't mean becoming detached from reality or ignoring difficulty. It means engaging with reality in a way that isn't distorted by immediate judgment. It means allowing things to be seen as they are, without layering them with assumptions that create unnecessary suffering. And in that clarity, better decisions begin to emerge. Actions become more intentional. You're no longer reacting to the first thought that appears. You're responding based on a broader understanding of what's actually happening. Over time, this creates a kind of internal stability that doesn't depend on circumstances being perfect. You're still affected by what happens, but not controlled by it in the same way. There's a difference between feeling something and being carried away by it. And that difference becomes clearer the more you practice observing your thoughts instead of immediately identifying with them. It's a quiet shift, but it builds strength in a way that force never could. And as that strength grows, something else begins to fade. The need to constantly interpret every situation in a way that either confirms success or reinforces failure starts to lose its urgency. There's less pressure to define everything immediately, more space to simply experience, to reflect, to move forward without needing every moment to carry a specific meaning. And in that space, your relationship with yourself becomes more stable, less reactive, more grounded in something that isn't easily shaken. What remains is a clearer understanding of where your influence truly lies, not in shaping every outcome, not in controlling every external detail, but in how you meet each moment as it comes. That's where the real shift happens, quietly, steadily, without needing to announce itself. And once it begins, it changes, not just how you think, but how you move through everything that follows. And then comes the part that tests everything you think you've understood so far. Not action, not discipline, not even clarity, but patience. The kind that doesn't feel rewarding in the moment. The kind that doesn't give you immediate feedback. The kind that forces you to sit in uncertainty without reaching for control as a way to escape it. Because even after you've done the work, even after you've adjusted your mindset and let go of that constant need to force outcomes, there's still that quiet voice in the background asking why things aren't moving faster. It doesn't disappear just because you've gained awareness. It lingers, subtle but persistent, questioning the process, questioning the timing, questioning whether something has gone wrong. That voice tends to get louder in stillness. When there's no immediate result, no clear sign that progress is happening, the mind starts searching for explanations. It tries to fill the gap with conclusions. Maybe the effort wasn't enough. Maybe the approach was wrong. Maybe this isn't going to work at all. And just like that, the urge to control starts creeping back in. The impulse to push harder, to adjust more aggressively, to speed things up in any way possible. It feels logical. It feels necessary. But underneath it, there's tension again. That same tension that was there before, just wearing a different shape. What's difficult about this stage is that nothing looks obviously wrong from the outside. You've taken the right steps. You've shown up consistently. You've stayed focused. And yet the results aren't aligning with your expectations. That gap between effort and outcome is where patience is tested the most, not when things are falling apart, but when things are simply not moving as quickly as you want them to. And in that space, it becomes very easy to misinterpret delay as failure, to assume that something needs to be fixed immediately, even when nothing is actually broken. This is where understanding timing becomes more than just an idea. It becomes something you have to live through. Growth doesn't always show itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it's happening beneath the surface in ways that aren't immediately visible. Skills are developing, perspective is shifting, awareness is deepening. But because none of that produces instant results, it can feel like nothing is happening at all. And that feeling creates pressure. Pressure to act, to change something, to do anything that might create movement. But not all movement is progress, and not all stillness is stagnation. Epictetus expressed this in a way that cuts through the impatience without dismissing it. No great thing is created suddenly. That idea isn't meant to slow you down. It's meant to ground you, to remind you that anything meaningful takes time to unfold. Not because it's being withheld, but because it's developing in stages that can't be rushed. Just like a structure needs a foundation before it can rise, your growth needs time to stabilize before it can produce visible results. And when you try to accelerate that process artificially, you don't strengthen it, you weaken it. The difficulty is that modern expectations don't align with this reality. Everything around you suggests speed. Immediate results, quick success, fast progress. And when your experience doesn't match that pace, it creates a sense of falling behind. But that sense is often based on comparison, not truth. You're measuring your progress against timelines that may not even apply to your situation. And in doing so, you lose sight of the fact that your path has its own rhythm, one that doesn't need to match anything outside of it. As you begin to accept that, patience starts to feel less like waiting and more like allowing. Allowing things to develop at the pace they need to, without constantly interfering. Allowing yourself to continue showing up without demanding immediate proof that it's working. And that shift removes a significant amount of pressure. You're no longer trying to force results into existence. You're creating the conditions for them to emerge naturally. And those conditions are built through consistency, clarity, and time. There's also a different kind of trust that begins to form here. Not blind optimism, not passive hope, but a grounded trust in the process itself. You start to see that not everything needs to be controlled to move forward. That your role is to act, to stay aligned, to keep refining your approach where necessary, but not to dictate the exact moment when everything should come together. That part doesn't belong to you. And once that becomes clear, the tension around timing begins to loosen. This doesn't mean impatience disappears completely. It still shows up from time to time, but it no longer dictates your actions in the same way. You notice it, you understand where it's coming from, and you choose not to let it pull you back into that cycle of force and control. You stay steady. You continue moving forward, even when there's no immediate reward. And over time, that steadiness becomes one of your strongest advantages. Because while others might rush, react, and burn out trying to speed things up, you're building something more sustainable, something that isn't dependent on constant validation or immediate outcomes. And when the results do begin to show, they carry a different kind of weight. Not because they came quickly, but because they were built on a foundation that wasn't rushed, forced, or compromised along the way. At some point, without a dramatic moment or a clear signal, the shift begins to happen. It doesn't arrive as a sudden realization or a single decision. It builds quietly through small adjustments in how you think, how you act, and how you relate to what you're pursuing. What once felt like chasing starts to feel unnecessary. That constant urgency, that need to reach something as quickly as possible, begins to lose its hold, and in its place, something steadier starts to form. Not slower in a negative sense, but more deliberate, more grounded, more aware of what actually matters and what doesn't. Chasing always carries a certain kind of energy. It's driven by fear, even if it doesn't always look like it on the surface. Fear of missing out on an opportunity. Fear of falling behind others who seem to be moving faster. Fear of not being enough as you are. And because it's rooted in fear, it creates urgency. It pushes you to act quickly, sometimes without fully thinking things through. It makes everything feel immediate, as if every decision carries a level of importance that demands instant action. But that urgency comes at a cost. It pulls your attention in too many directions at once. It makes it harder to focus, harder to stay clear, harder to move with any real sense of stability. When you're in that state, your actions start to reflect that internal pressure. You might take on things that don't truly align with what you want, simply because they feel like opportunities you can't afford to miss. You might say yes when you should say no, just to keep momentum going. You might rush decisions that would benefit from a bit more time and reflection, and over time, that creates a kind of scattered movement. You're doing a lot, but not always in a way that moves you meaningfully forward. There's effort, but not always direction. There's motion, but not always progress. Alignment feels different from the beginning. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand immediate results. It starts with clarity. You understand what you're doing, and more importantly, why you're doing it. That clarity acts as a filter. It helps you recognize what fits and what doesn't. It allows you to move forward without needing to grab onto everything that comes your way. And because of that, your actions become more focused. You're no longer reacting to every possibility. You're choosing based on what actually aligns with your direction. That shift from reacting to choosing changes the entire experience. There's less noise, less second-guessing. You're not constantly wondering if you're missing something or falling behind. You're engaged with what you've chosen to focus on, and that engagement creates a sense of stability. You're still moving forward, but without that underlying tension that comes from trying to keep up with everything at once. And that stability allows you to think more clearly, to act more precisely, and to adjust when necessary without feeling like everything is at risk. Seneca captured something close to this when he said that if a man knows not to which port he sails, no wind is favorable. Without clarity, every direction feels uncertain. Every opportunity feels equally urgent. And that creates confusion rather than progress. But when you're aligned, you know your direction. You don't need every opportunity to be favorable. You only need the ones that move you closer to where you're actually going. And that makes decision-making simpler, not because the choices disappear, but because your perspective becomes clearer. As this way of moving becomes more natural, you start to notice how much energy was being wasted before. Not just in actions, but in thoughts. The constant comparison, the internal pressure, the need to keep up with everything, it all begins to fade. In its place, there's a quieter focus. You're still aware of what's happening around you, but it doesn't pull you off course as easily. You stay centered in what you're doing, and that consistency begins to build momentum in a different way. Not through speed, but through direction. There's also a different kind of confidence that starts to develop. Not the kind that comes from external validation or immediate success, but the kind that comes from knowing you're moving in a way that makes sense for you. You trust your decisions more because they're grounded in clarity rather than urgency. And that trust reduces the need to constantly check, adjust, and seek reassurance. You're not looking for confirmation at every step. You're moving forward based on a deeper understanding of what matters. This doesn't mean everything becomes easy. Challenges still come, uncertainty still exists, but your relationship to those challenges changes. You're not thrown off by them in the same way, because your movement isn't based on reacting to every external shift. It's based on something more stable. You can adapt without losing direction. You can adjust without feeling like you're starting over. And that makes the entire process feel more sustainable over time. As this continues, the difference between chasing and aligning becomes impossible to ignore. One drains you, pulling you in multiple directions without clear purpose. The other supports you, guiding your actions in a way that feels consistent and grounded. And once you've experienced that difference, it becomes much harder to go back to that constant state of urgency. Not because you're forcing yourself to avoid it, but because it no longer feels necessary. What remains is a way of moving that is both intentional and calm. You're still pursuing what matters to you, but you're doing it without that underlying fear driving every decision. You're not trying to control every outcome. You're focusing on your direction, your actions, your presence. And in that space, progress begins to take on a different quality. It's not rushed. It's not forced. It's steady, clear, and built on something that doesn't collapse under pressure. There's a point where it starts to feel almost counterintuitive. Everything you've been taught suggests that more effort should lead to better results, that pushing harder should bring things closer, that intensity is the path forward. And yet, the more pressure you apply, the more things seem to blur. Decisions become less clear, reactions become quicker, but not necessarily better. It's as if the very thing you believe is helping you is quietly working against you. And that's where the shift toward calm begins to make sense, not as a passive state, but as a more effective one. Tension has a way of narrowing your perception. When you're anxious, your focus becomes tight, almost tunnel-like. You start looking for immediate solutions, quick fixes, anything that can relieve the discomfort of uncertainty. But in doing so, you miss what sits just outside that narrow frame. Opportunities that don't match your immediate expectations get overlooked. Signals that require a bit of patience to recognize get ignored. And your decisions start to come from a place of urgency rather than clarity. You're still moving, but you're not always moving well. In contrast, when your mind is calm, something opens up. Your awareness expands. You're able to take in more information without feeling overwhelmed by it. You notice patterns that weren't obvious before. You see connections that didn't stand out under pressure. And because of that, your decisions become more precise. You're not reacting to the first thought or emotion that appears. You're allowing a moment of space, just enough to choose your response instead of being driven by impulse. That small difference, repeated over time, creates a completely different trajectory. This doesn't mean that calmness eliminates effort. You're still engaged, still focused, still taking action. But the quality of that action changes. It becomes more deliberate. You're no longer overcorrecting every time something shifts slightly. You're not constantly second-guessing yourself in the middle of moving forward. There's a steadiness that supports your decisions, even when the outcome isn't immediately clear. And that steadiness allows you to stay consistent in a way that tension never could. Marcus Aurelius once reflected that the impediment to action advances action, and what stands in the way becomes the way. That idea carries a deeper meaning when viewed through this lens. Obstacles don't just test your effort, they test your state of mind. If you meet them with tension, they become heavier, more complicated, more overwhelming. But if you meet them with clarity, they reveal something useful. They show you where to adjust, where to refine, where to grow. The obstacle itself doesn't change. What changes is how effectively you can work with it. Over time, these small shifts in how you respond begin to compound. One clear decision leads to another. One moment of patience prevents an unnecessary reaction. One instance of awareness allows you to recognize an opportunity that would have otherwise passed unnoticed. None of these moments feel dramatic on their own. They're subtle, almost easy to overlook. But together, they create momentum. A different kind of momentum, not built on force but on consistency and clarity. What's important to understand is that relaxing isn't about stepping back from life. It's about stepping back from unnecessary pressure. It's about removing the tension that interferes with your ability to think and act effectively. When that tension fades, your natural ability to respond improves. You don't need to push yourself into better decisions. They start to emerge more naturally because your mind isn't clouded by constant urgency. There's also a shift in how you experience time. Under pressure, everything feels rushed. You feel like you're always behind, always trying to catch up, always needing to move faster. But when you're calm, time feels different. There's more space in each moment. You're not trying to compress everything into immediate results. You're allowing things to unfold at a pace that makes sense, and in doing so, you actually become more efficient. Not because you're moving faster, but because you're moving with greater precision. As this becomes more familiar, the idea that relaxation leads to better outcomes stops feeling strange. It starts to feel logical. You begin to see how much of your previous effort was being diluted by tension, how many decisions were influenced by anxiety rather than clarity, and how different things feel when that pressure is removed. You're still working, still progressing, but without the constant sense of strain that once accompanied it. The result isn't immediate transformation, it's gradual refinement, a steady improvement in how you think, how you act, how you respond. And over time, that refinement leads to outcomes that feel more aligned, more natural, more sustainable. Not because they were forced into place, but because you created the conditions for them to develop. And those conditions come from a state of mind that is clear, grounded, and free from the unnecessary weight of constant control. There's a certain kind of person you've probably noticed, even if you couldn't quite explain what sets them apart. They move through situations with a sense of ease that doesn't look forced or rehearsed. They're focused, but not tense, engaged, but not overwhelmed. It's not that their lives are free from difficulty or uncertainty, it's that they don't carry those things in a way that weighs them down. There's space in how they think, in how they respond, in how they move forward, and because of that, things seem to unfold around them in a way that feels almost natural. At first, it's easy to assume that they've simply figured something out that others haven't, that they have more confidence, more skill, more experience. But when you look closer, the difference isn't always in what they have. It's in how they relate to what they have. They don't approach every situation with the need to control it. They don't treat every outcome as something that must go a certain way. Instead, they trust their ability to respond, whatever the outcome may be, and that trust changes how they show up before anything even happens. There's a quiet confidence in that approach. Not loud, not performative, but steady. It doesn't come from knowing that everything will work out exactly as planned. It comes from knowing that even if it doesn't, they'll be able to handle it. That understanding removes a significant amount of pressure. They're not trying to eliminate uncertainty. They're moving through it without letting it dictate their state of mind. And because of that, they remain open in ways that others often aren't. Openness is what allows them to notice opportunities that don't fit into rigid expectations. It allows them to adapt when things change instead of resisting those changes. It allows them to engage fully with what's in front of them instead of constantly looking ahead for reassurance. And over time, that openness creates a different kind of experience. Things don't feel as constrained. There's more room for movement, more room for growth, more room for unexpected possibilities to emerge. Carl Jung once observed that what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. That idea becomes very clear in this context. When you approach life with tension, trying to control every detail, you end up amplifying the very uncertainty you're trying to eliminate. Every small shift feels significant. Every delay feels like a problem, and that resistance creates a kind of internal pressure that closes you off. You become less flexible, less aware, less able to adjust, not because you lack ability, but because your focus is consumed by trying to hold everything in place. On the other side of that, when you approach life with trust, the experience changes. You're not ignoring challenges or pretending that everything is easy. You're simply not adding unnecessary pressure to what's already there. You allow situations to develop without immediately trying to control them. You give yourself the space to respond instead of react. And in doing so, you stay connected to what's actually happening rather than what you fear might happen. This difference becomes even more noticeable when you consider the mindset of scarcity. When someone believes there isn't enough time, enough success, enough opportunity, it shapes how they see everything. They start to hold on tightly to whatever they have, afraid of losing it. They rush decisions, trying to secure outcomes before they slip away. They compare themselves constantly, measuring their progress against others in a way that creates even more pressure. And without realizing it, they close themselves off. Not because they want to, but because their focus is on protecting what they feel is limited. That sense of limitation affects how they act. It makes them cautious in the wrong ways and impulsive in others. They might hesitate when an opportunity requires patience, or rush when it requires thought. Their actions become inconsistent, not because they lack discipline, but because they're being driven by a belief that something is missing, and that belief shapes their experience more than any external circumstance. In contrast, someone who operates from a sense of trust doesn't feel the same urgency to secure everything immediately. They recognize that opportunities come and go, that timing shifts, that outcomes aren't always predictable. But instead of reacting to that unpredictability with fear, they respond with steadiness. They focus on what they can do, what they can influence, what they can build over time, and that focus creates a different kind of momentum. As this becomes more apparent, the distinction between tension and trust starts to feel more significant. It's not just about how you feel internally, it's about how that internal state shapes everything you do. The way you think, the way you decide, the way you interact with the world. And over time, those small differences in approach lead to completely different outcomes. What remains is a simple but important reflection, not something that needs to be answered immediately, but something to be considered as you move forward. Are your actions being driven by pressure or by clarity? Are you holding on tightly because you feel like you have to, or are you allowing things to unfold while staying grounded in what you can control? The answer to that question shapes more than just your results. It shapes your entire experience along the way. At the end of all of this, it becomes clear that nothing here is asking you to stop trying. There's no suggestion to become passive, to step away from what matters, or to abandon the things you've been working toward. The shift is more precise than that. It's about refining how you engage with those things. You still act, you still move forward, you still put in effort where it counts, but the quality of that effort changes. It becomes grounded instead of rushed, focused instead of scattered, steady instead of reactive. And that change in quality alters the entire experience, even if the actions themselves look similar on the surface. Before, effort might have been tied to urgency. It carried a sense that something needed to happen quickly, that progress had to be visible right away, that delays meant something was going wrong. That kind of effort often feels intense, but it's not always effective. It's driven by pressure, by the need to control outcomes, by the fear of things not working out. And because of that, it tends to burn energy quickly. It leads to overthinking, overcorrecting, and eventually exhaustion. Not because effort itself is exhausting, but because of the way it's being applied. When that pressure begins to fade, effort takes on a different form. It becomes more deliberate. You're still working, but you're not rushing every step. You're still focused, but you're not constantly checking whether the outcome is aligning exactly as planned. There's a sense of stability behind your actions, a feeling that you're doing what needs to be done without needing immediate confirmation that it's working. And that stability allows you to stay consistent in a way that urgency never could. You're not burning out after short bursts of intensity. You're building something that can continue over time. This is where the idea of control becomes more grounded. You begin to see clearly what actually belongs to you. Your actions, your discipline, your attention, those remain fully within your reach. They're stable, reliable, always available. But outcomes, timing, external responses, those sit outside of that space. They're influenced by factors you can't fully predict or manage. And once you accept that distinction, you stop trying to control everything at once. You focus your energy where it can actually make a difference, and you release the rest. Not because it doesn't matter, but because it doesn't belong to you. That release creates a kind of quiet confidence, not the kind that needs to prove itself constantly, not the kind that depends on everything going right, but a deeper, more stable form. It comes from knowing that you can act with clarity regardless of what happens, that you can continue moving forward even when results are delayed or uncertain. And that confidence doesn't fluctuate the way outcome-based confidence does. It doesn't rise and fall with every success or setback. It remains steady because it's rooted in something you can actually control. Epictetus expressed this idea in a way that feels both simple and complete. Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. There's no resistance in that statement, no urgency, no pressure, just a clear direction. Focus on what you can influence, accept what you can't, and within that balance, find your way forward. It doesn't remove difficulty, it doesn't guarantee results, but it removes the unnecessary struggle that comes from trying to control what was never yours to begin with. As this way of thinking becomes more natural, your relationship with progress begins to change. You're no longer measuring every step against a fixed expectation. You're not constantly asking whether things are happening fast enough or exactly as planned. Instead, you're paying attention to the quality of what you're doing. You're refining your actions, improving your approach, staying present with the process. And because of that, progress becomes something you can actually engage with, rather than something you're always chasing. There's also a sense of ease that begins to emerge, not because things become effortless, but because the unnecessary weight has been removed. You're still facing challenges, still navigating uncertainty, but you're not carrying the added pressure of needing everything to unfold perfectly. You're allowing things to develop while staying grounded in your own actions. And that balance makes the entire experience feel more sustainable, more aligned, more natural. Over time, the difference between forcing and aligning becomes undeniable. Forcing creates resistance. It tightens everything, drains energy, and leads to outcomes that feel unstable even when they arrive. Aligning, on the other hand, creates flow. It allows things to develop without unnecessary interference. It supports consistent action without constant pressure. And while it may not always feel as immediate, it builds something far more reliable in the long run. What remains is a way of moving that doesn't rely on urgency to create progress. You act because it's the right action to take, not because you're trying to force a specific result. You stay focused on what you can control, and you allow everything else to unfold as it will. And in that space, something shifts quietly but permanently. You stop chasing outcomes as if they define you, and you start aligning your actions with a clarity that doesn't depend on them. And from that place, progress begins to take on a different meaning, one that isn't driven by pressure, but guided by purpose and sustained by a steady, grounded sense of control. As everything begins to settle into place, there's one final layer that often goes unnoticed, and yet it ties everything together in a way that makes the entire approach sustainable. It's the understanding that this isn't a one-time shift. It's not something you realize once and then carry perfectly forever. It's something you return to, again and again, especially in moments where the pressure starts creeping back in. Because it will. There will be times when things feel urgent again, when outcomes feel important in a way that pulls you back toward control. And in those moments, what matters isn't perfection, it's awareness. That awareness allows you to catch yourself before the old patterns fully take over. You notice when your thoughts start racing ahead of the present moment. You recognize when your actions begin to carry that familiar tension. And instead of following that pattern all the way through, you pause. Not dramatically, not in a way that interrupts everything, but just enough to shift your attention back to what's actually within your control. That pause is small, but it's powerful. It creates space. And within that space, you have a choice. Over time, these small moments of awareness begin to build into something stronger. You don't need to constantly remind yourself of every principle. You don't need to force yourself to stay calm or detached. It becomes more natural. Your mind begins to default to a steadier way of thinking. You respond more often than you react. You focus more on your actions than on outcomes. And when things don't go as planned, you adjust without immediately assuming something is wrong. That shift doesn't remove challenges, but it changes how you move through them. There's also a deeper sense of trust that starts to develop, not just in the process, but in yourself. You begin to trust that you can handle uncertainty without needing to control it, that you can move forward without having every answer in advance. And that trust reduces the need for constant reassurance. You're no longer looking for signs that everything is working perfectly. You're grounded in the understanding that progress isn't always visible in the moment, but it's still happening. Seneca once reflected that true happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future. That idea captures this final layer in a simple way. When your attention is no longer pulled forward by constant worry or pressure, you become more present with what you're doing. And in that presence, there's a different kind of satisfaction, not one that depends on results, but one that comes from being fully engaged with the process itself. And from there, everything begins to feel more aligned. Not because life suddenly becomes predictable, but because you're no longer trying to force it into a specific shape. You're working with it instead of against it. You're moving with clarity instead of pressure. And that quiet shift, repeated over time, is what allows everything else to fall into place naturally. In the end, nothing truly meant for you requires you to chase it with desperation. What's meant for you asks for clarity, patience, and the strength to stay grounded while everything unfolds. The moment you stop forcing life, you stop fighting it, and that's when things begin to move in ways you couldn't control, but always needed. If this spoke to something deeper in you, there's another video on the screen right now that will take you even further into this way of thinking. Stay with it. Keep building that inner strength. And truly, thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal.